in the interview of in the whole range of characters, fictional characters, who is the one you feel deeply identified with, you took the name of Paul Pennyfeather in Wars, Decline and Fall. And let me remind you what one of the characters says in this uh, satiric novel of war. He says, what will remind you of Mundokunip, something which is funny and profound at the same time. He says this life is like a merry-go-round, but I like to get down this merry-go-round and then see it go around. So this reminded me of Mundopanishad, Suparna bird. There are two birds sitting on the same branch in one of the Upanishads, and one of them is pecking at the fruit of karma, and the other one is just watching it. So this is how you raise cultural parallels in world literature. I was intrigued by your sense of humor. Nothing shows a man's character but more than what he laughs at. And if a person chooses to laugh at one own's incongruity, I mean, nothing like that. And there's no doubt about your scholarship. That's why I'm looking forward to your presentation. And only when I'll make my comments, only I've heard what you have to say. Please carry on.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Anamika and Pavan, for your very kind introduction. So I'm just going to be sharing some slides. So I'll just try and get that set up. Okay, so I hope that's all working and you can see the slides. Okay. So I want to start today by very much acknowledging my own ignorance. I'm not only joining you remotely today from Dublin, but I've never been to India or indeed any other part of the subcontinent. My ignorance is also, among many other things, linguistic, of course. I have no knowledge of the many languages spoken in India other than English. This, of course, should qualify everything I'm about to say, particularly in speaking to a conference which has the heading of the colonial gaze. However, in being so, I very much resemble my two subjects today, W.B. Yeats, who never traveled to India either, and who relied heavily on the expertise of others in his various points of contact with Indian culture and thought. I also somewhat resemble Louis MacNeice, the other poet I'm going to be talking about today. MacNeice did make it to India. He spent several months there in the momentous year of 1947 as part of a team sent by the BBC to cover the independence of India and Pakistan. Reflecting later on his experiences, he described India as the most foreign country I have ever visited. If we use the word foreign for Italy or Iceland, we should really find some other word for India. Such a statement's underlining of difference, which itself might risk reinscribing exoticism, is very much in keeping with MacNeice's various responses to this trip to India. It might as such be related to one of Yeats's presentations of Indian culture for a Western readership, his 1912 introduction to the English language edition of Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. There, Yeats also foregrounds cultural distance. A whole people, a whole civilization, immeasurably strange to us, seems to have been taken up into this imagination. However, Yeats then makes a further claim of recognition as regards Tagore's self-translated devotional poems. And yet, we are not moved because of its strangeness, but because we have met our own image, as though he had walked in Rossetti's Willow Wood, or heard, perhaps for the first time in literature, our voice as in a dream. as Justin Quinn has described, the poems are presented as strange to us because they come from a distant culture of which we know little. This exoticizes them. If he had left it at that, Yeats would merge into the pantheon of 19th century Orientalism. But the counter-maneuver swings thought in a different direction towards the description of a world soul. Such a stress on the soul, on the spiritual value of Tagore's poetry, and by extension the nature of Indian or at least Bengali culture, was later cast in a questionable light by McNeice, or rather his friend, the Indian novelist Mok Raj Anand. In McNeice's unfinished memoir, The Strings Are False, a work he drafted around 1940-41, but lay unpublished till after his death, McNeice recounts a period in the summer of 1939 when he was working every day in the British Museum, in the library at the British Museum. Yeats had died that January, so January 1939, and McNeice was then writing a study of his poetry, one of the earliest studies published on Yeats's work. I think still a very valuable one, a very good one. Outside the library, McNeice meets Raj Anand, and he reports, a conversation I had with him about Yeats brought up the subject of spiritual India. It was all a mistake, Mok said. India was not spiritual. No Indian had even thought so until 50 years ago. India was earthy, matter of fact. It was the Anglo-Indians who had loud-peddled her alleged mysticism. Even Rabindranath Tagore, a very fine poet, Mok said in the original, had got a lot of his mystical stuff from retired English officials. Anand, as a crusader for the Indian left, as McNeice describes him, is somewhat aligned with McNeice's own position at this time as a young, left-leaning, somewhat social realist writer, iconoclastically looking back on the decidedly romantic excesses of their near forebears. This was, after all, a McNeice who had opened his 1938 book-length personal essay titled Modern Poetry with a call for a reconnection between the poet and other men, kind of ordinary men, away from the excesses of art for art's sake and of pure poetry, which he saw as having characterized the kind of late 19th into early 20th century period. He, by contrast, sketches the model poet in that book as reacting with intelligence and emotion to things and to experiences. And on this basis, presenting poetry which is at once a communicative record of those things and experiences, whilst also being an aesthetic creation in its own right. To step back, in tracing something of Yeats's and McNeice's contact with and attitudes towards India and its culture, certain tensions, I hope are starting to emerge between difference and distance, and indeed exoticism on the one hand, and similarity or recognition or community on the other. Alongside this opposition is also one of the spiritual or soulful, perhaps as some kind of basis for connection or universality, versus matter and things and a notion of the real. Where Yeats in 1912 and 1913, as we enter into the period in aesthetic we would generally talk of as modernism or modernist, leans towards the spiritual and the visionary, and what India might offer in such terms, in terms of connection and integration across cultures. McNeice, transitioning out of modernism into the Second World War and its decolonizing aftermath, emphasizes difference and what seems like an altogether more skeptical materialist realism. However, any such seeming polarity, I think, is complicated in thinking about Yeats and McNeice, not only in relation to India and its cultures, but also in comparative terms in relation to each other. What emerges out of this triangulation is a McNeice, in part via Yeats and India, who is, I think, a surprisingly spiritually engaged, even mystical poet. As for Yeats, he certainly comes to reckon in his later work with the difficulties of spiritual or cultural integration and connection, perhaps not so much by Indian culture, or indeed the younger McNeice, but rather through certain experiences and circumstances that kind of relate to work, affect his work closer to home. Indeed, while McNeice is in 1939 living and working and publishing in London, and will during the Second World War start to work for the BBC in London, and while Yeats is introducing a book by Tagore that is published in London, the city in which he is then primarily living, and is also introducing Tagore in decidedly, I think, English cultural terms. And we've seen that a bit already, and I was quoting that the link Yeats makes to Dante Gabriel Rossetti in his Willowwood sonnets. The Dublin-born Yeats and the Belfast-born McNeice also share a complex sense of home in relation to Ireland. This recollected encounter with Mulk Raj Anand in 1939 takes place, McNeice tells us, outside a British museum in which one is searched on the gate on the way in for Irish Republican Army bombs. The IRA in 1939 and 1940 in England had been engaged in really quite a considerable campaign, the so-called S-Plan or sabotage campaign, which saw 300 explosions or acts of sabotage, 10 deaths, and 96 injuries during this campaign. This was, of course, a campaign waged against the partition of Ireland and what the IRA saw as the British occupation of the 6 counties that constituted Northern Ireland, so the part of Northern Ireland that remained in union with Britain as part of the United Kingdom. With its capital in Belfast, the Belfast McNeice had been born in. Later that summer and throughout the autumn of 1939, during which period Germany invaded Poland, and then Britain and France declared war on Germany, McNeice headed to Ireland for several weeks. There he crisscrossed this border from his family in a north now in blackout to a now neutral Dublin, still a dance with lights and laughter. McNeice was pondering whether he might himself leave England and for the south of Ireland, or follow W.H. Auden and others of his close associates to the United States of America. Indeed, on the day that war was declared, his memoir recollects drinking with the Dublin literati in a pub in Dublin, who hardly mentioned the war, but rather, in what he later saw as a somewhat escapist fashion, debated the correct versions of Dublin street songs. McNeice would then move on to the United States for a time, equivocating about where he would kind of commit to or reside during the war. But in late 1940, he did return to England and committed to the British war effort and started working as a staff writer and producer for the BBC. Such a story of ambivalence and division echoes forward to McNeice's own reckoning with India and Pakistan's partition at independence. But McNeice's consciousness of partition in Ireland and India also makes more legible the complex relationship between Yeats's contact with Tagore. Tagore, I think we should remember, who had lived through a partition of East and West Bengal from 1905 to 1911, and yet his own somewhat kind of hidden or even suppressed response to the emerging possibility of the partition of Ireland and the sectarianism to which it was related as it kind of emerged and gathered force in the early 1910s. In his introduction to Gitanjali, Yeats romantically idealizes the world out of which Tagore's poems have come. He writes, "The work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and rushes. a tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing, has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and of the noble. If the civilization of Bengal remains unbroken, if that common mind which, as one divines, runs through all, is not, as with us, broken into a dozen minds that know nothing of each other, something even of what is most subtle in these verses will have come in a few generations to the beggar on the roads. Such a quote stress on unity on a common culture was in 1912 in Ireland, however, undergoing significant strain, including as regards these forces that within a decade would lead to the partition of Ireland alongside its own partial independence. Okay, so I want to turn now more squarely towards McNeice and his literary response to his time in India in 1947, before then going back to Yeats and his engagement with, particularly with Tagore in the 1910s. So McNeice's job at the BBC was in something called the features department. Radio features were a kind of hybrid genre working between and across documentary on the one hand and radio drama on the other. So they kind of mixed recorded sound with the recreation of documentary type content by actors and also kind of more imaginative drama type content without quite crossing the boundary over into the realm of the radio play outright. So they were quite an important genre in radio, including and particularly at the BBC in the mid-century, but they kind of by the 60s they kind of been phased out. McNeice and another writer from the features department, Jack Dillon, traveled to India in August 1947, therefore not to offer direct reportage on events, but rather to gather material that back in London they wrote up into several programs. To execute this brief, McNeice stayed in the country for some time. He landed on the 6th of August, so just over a week before independence, and finally left in the second week of November. So he was there for a good 3 months. He also traveled widely. He was based in New Delhi for the first month, but from there visited Agra, Lahore, Peshawar. In September, he went to Kashmir. In October, across to Calcutta, Varanasi, Benares, as he would have known it, Lucknow, then south to Chennai, and further right down to the southern tip of India. We have a detailed account of McNeice's impressions during this period. He kept a diary. He also sent very long letters to his wife, and he drew on both for the scripts he subsequently wrote. At the end of August, he wrote to his wife, Hedley, of the horrors he had been witnessing in the Punjab. So in Delhi, he's having quite an interesting time, and he's quite lively. But at the end of the month, he travels up into the Punjab, and he witnesses, the chaos that is unfolding. On Wednesday, I visited a refugee camp of Muslims in the East Punjab. 30,000 refugees in the camp, most of them dazed and with nothing but the rags they stood up in or lay down in, more arriving every minute. The very same afternoon, not knowing what I was going to see, I went to a place called Sheikhupura. The victims in this case, as it was West Punjab, were the non-Muslims, particularly the Sikhs. Quite impossible to get correct figures for casualties or a true account of how it started, but I'm glad I've not got a sense of smell. The first thing we saw was the hospital, about 80 people in it, very badly injured, lying on bare beds in rags, flat out and covered with flies. Just one doctor and apparently no equipment. The next thing was about 1,500 of the Sikh and Hindu community, a minority, men, women, and children, huddled in a high school, debouching into the street and waiting for precarious transport from it all. A large number of these had been wounded with swords or spears, and their white clothes were covered with rusty, brown, dried blood, some with their hands cut off, etc., and again the hordes of flies. Such horrific scenes had a distinct effect on McNeece's work for the BBC. Later in September, he wrote a long letter to the head of features, Lawrence Gilliam, back in London, in which he pleaded for the BBC to rethink its plans for the programmes. So he writes, it's a really long letter, but this is some of it. To stress at this moment security, justice, good order, or unity bestowed by the Raj would be surely most inopportune. Arthur Moore, very intelligent liberal, ex-editor of the Indian Statesman, said to me, rightly I feel, that the one justification of the Raj would be if India remains a unity, not necessarily implying an end of partition. If we haven't given them nationhood and self-coherence, we've given them nothing. But if chaos persists, says Moore, then our unity was a sham, and the less said about it, the better. McNeice then goes on in this letter to list a whole load of things that cannot, he thinks, be explicitly billed in the series. So things that the series can't be kind of orientated around or advertised and listed on the basis of. These include the army, administration, democracy, industry, engineering, commerce and trade, religion, and the present communal violence and trouble. He also argues against pursuing a radio partitioning in devoting separate programs to India and Pakistan. So he's kind of this kind of real sense of the difficulty of representation, the number of topics that cannot be addressed in the present circumstances. Rather, McNeice proposes a series of programs that will cover both the new states at once, as one. Sorry. On returning to London, this kind of robust exchange continues, with McNeice explaining to his BBC bosses that I can only honestly offer you programs based on what I saw and felt myself. I saw and felt too much to offer you anything else. McNeice eventually went on to write 3 hour-long scripts for programs that were first broadcast in May and then March and then May 1948. One was titled India at First Sight, one was titled Portrait of Delhi, and another The Road to Independence. They're in this kind of drama documentary road of the feature I was trying to describe, with everyman observers encountering kind of personifications, as well as kind of actual historical and contemporary figures. Amid the fluid, kind of confident, almost fairly didactic tone of this mode of radio writing, however, notable is the displacement of authority McNeice goes to great lengths to insert programs. An extreme example of this is the name of the British protagonist in his program Portrait of Delhi. The protagonist is named Ignorance. His personification is the value of ignorance in this kind of allegorical personification that he uses in that program. The Radio Times listing for India at First Sight, so I've got the Radio Times listings up here on the slide, written from the BBC archives, it's clear McNeice wrote this listing. So this listing for India at First Sight, much of this listing is then repeated in the recording by the radio announcer as well. This announcement explains that the program is based on the author's own first impressions, and I'm quoting here, does not claim therefore to be objective, and that India is being, I'm quoting again, glimpsed solely through Western eyes, while the visitor, who is the protagonist, a middle-class Englishman, is attended solely by the Western familiars of his mind, for it is only gropingly and fleetingly that any visitor can cope with India at first sight. So that's been very kind of heavily used to frame the program, and the program itself is kind of circumscribed in its perspective. So the English protagonist, it's not only his Western eyes, but all his interlocutors in this program are themselves Western. So it's a really interesting kind of framing and limiting of perspective. These familiar voices include a nanny, his uncle Howard, who was an old India hand, a missionary, But also we get this interesting kind of splitting of the self. We get a kind of still voice in this documentary, which is seemingly a kind of voice of inner conscience, urging openness and cultural relativism. For instance, this still voice says to Edward, the protagonist, the visitor, learn Urdu, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, Pashto. You still won't have learnt the Indian of the Indian soul or souls. So when people discuss the Indian question or questions, don't be too sure you know the answers. So this is kind of constant raising of doubt and limitation. The Radio Times listing again also talks of India only being discoverable, as it were, through translation. Alongside this kind of notion of the difficulty of translation, this displacement of authority of the colonial gaze, McNeice also from the get-go highlights the fact of partition and the difficulty of nomenclature, I can't say that, of naming as an issue, therefore. The announcer talks of the subcontinent, which is throughout referred to as India. So we immediately have the difficulty of India now having these kind of two names, or these two territories, and this other term, the subcontinent. So he's kind of highlighting that, but also highlighting that the program is going to use India for both of the new states. McNeice's letters make clear quite how much he was thinking of India in relation to Ireland throughout this period as regards questions of nationalism and politics. And in the third documentary, The Road to Independence, we get an Indian and a Hindu trading quotes from a George Bernard Shaw play about Ireland, John Bull's Other Ireland, as regards the undesirability of an overly militant and subconscious nationalism, but also an acknowledgement that that kind of subconsciousness is induced by occupation, by colonialism. Foregrounded again is McNeice's unease with the West's association of India with spirituality. The opening of India at First Sight highlights the protagonist's unease with, I'm quoting here, all that yogi cum swami stuff, echoing McNeice's earlier kind of judgment of Yeats via Mulk Raj Anand. This is an unease, though, that gets somewhat loosened through the program, as is suggested by the very kind of supralinguistic language of the Indian soul posited by the still voice in the program. Portrait of Delhi, so one of the other of the three programs, also seems to try to ascend above the material into the air via the medium of radio itself. Asaya Lodi notes McNeice's decision in this program to have the protagonist, Ignorance, be guided on his journey by a native, so an Indian shape-shifting bird, as they look down on overlapping scenes raging across history and also crucially across space, across kind of boundaries of space. So Lodi writes, the sky above or the air is thus configured as a place where cultural and national borders can be crossed and transgressed, and where transmogrification allows for divergent vantage points and perspectives. In this respect, the conceit of the Indian bird typifies modernism's many engagements with notions of nation space and aerial activity, echoing the use, for instance, of aeroplanes in the novels of Virginia Woolf. There is an embrace of the air, and of waves, and that kind of sense of radio as part of the air and the waves, and the space-binding nature of radio. So radio travels through the waves, but it therefore also connects space. Of its links to notions of imagined community, and of its potential to carry a new kind of meaning, a transnational, cosmopolitan, post-empire vision of the nation. And she's thinking of the fact that this is obviously being broadcast back, from London to a primarily British audience. She goes on, this is writ large in another piece of shape-shifting at the feature's end. And at the end, the end of McNeice's feature, it's not bombs, but still birds or planes that shower Delhi's landscape with roses as it imagines Gandhi's funeral taking place. So we get this kind of very evocative bit at the end of the radio broadcast in which we get this this showering of roses from this aerial perspective, from these planes which are described as steel birds across Gandhi's funeral, which of course then very fairly recently taken place. To Lodi's account, we might add that the bird and radio enabled transcendence of physical boundaries in this feature is also figuring spiritual connection and uplift. As well as the day job of radio writing, McNeice also wrote several poems about his experiences in India. The first was written during the trip, entitled Letter from India, and addressed to his wife, Hedley. It was followed by Mahabali Puram, written on his return to Britain in 1948. And this is a kind of quasi-ekphrastic poem written in direct response to his visiting of the religious monuments fronting the sea there. And in 1950 to 51, so later still, he then wrote a sequence called Didymus, one of a book called 10 Burnt Offerings, in which he considered the Apostle Thomas's possible journeying to India in the aftermath of the crucifixion of Jesus. And something all three of these poems share is a paralleling of geographical and cultural connection with the kind of searching for a more spiritual sense of connection. Letter from India, for instance, opens, "Our letters cross by nosing silver, place of a skull, skull of a star, each answer coming late and little, the airmail being no avatar. And thence I think I know you are, I feel divided as forever." The letters in their planes cross Calvary or Golgotha, the meaning of that name Golgotha in Aramaic and ancient Greece is skull. So there's a kind of clear reference there. Of course, the site of Jesus's crucifixion outside the walls of Jerusalem. So he's imagining these planes crossing Palestine, as they possibly might have, kind of geographically, but he's also kind of making that, distinctly kind of religious. Yet, unlike Jesus, these letters' subsequent descent does not constitute an avatar, an incarnation of a deity. Rather, such division is perpetuated. And the final two lines of that first stanza kind of have this interesting kind of use of syntax and elision and lineation, which means that division is not only between him and his wife, but I think also is kind of self-reflexive. It rebounds onto the speaker's self. We get that kind of standalone line, "I feel divided as forever." So I know you are, line break, "I feel divided as forever." So it's kind of rebounding back onto McNeice. This sense of division then gets explicitly mapped onto the intercommunal violence of partition that McNeice has witnessed in India later on in the poem. "I have seen Shekhupura High School fester with glaze-eyed refugees and the bad coin of fear inverted under piranha killers' trees, and like doomed oxen, those and these cooped by their past in a blind circle. And day by day, night upon nightmare, has spied old faults and sores laid bare, line upon lineless, measureless upon pretended measure, and no air to feed such premises as where a private plot would warrant shelter. For even should humanism always have been half impotent, debased, how for all that can her own children break from the retina encased in which our vision here must waste, meeting but waste the chance of vision." So we get kind of diversion, inversion, circle, line, measure, plot. These cognate words figure a deadly geometry of partition that circumscribes more measureless values. Within the again condensed elliptical syntax and grammar of this poem, it asks if it is possible to move beyond the wasting tyranny of a vision of the physical eye alone, the retina, an eye that is looking on such violence and waste, to some greater vision with a capital V, so some kind of extra beyond the kind of merely biological or physical vision. In Mahabalipuram, we again get this kind of nexus of a language of division, the possibility of interhuman communication, and the language of spirituality. It starts all alone from his dark sanctum, the lingam affronts the sea, the world's dead weight of breakers against sapling, bull, and cradle, where worship comes no more. Yet how should these cowherds and gods continue to dance in the rock all the long night along ocean in this lost border between that thronging, gonging mirage of paddy and toddy and dung and this uninhabited shore? So again, fronts, breakers, border, shore. This site is being presented to us as a liminal space, just as these monuments seem to mark a border between the manifest and the spiritual. They are now ruined and were never themselves alive in being stone, yet some kind of communication, incarnation even, is happening as these carvings dance for the viewer, the poetic viewer. Amidst word choices that hint at war and conflict, later on we're getting mention of squadrons, of chargers. The poetic speaker imagines the original sculptor finding the sculptures already somehow within the rock. They're kind of manifested in the rock. Then these sculptures communicate in the here and now to the modern Western visitor, breaking beyond, crossing over ignorance and distance. The rock face, it turns out, is, in the poem, neither strange nor dead. The jaded tourist and speaker, looker on, is afforded an ecstatic moment, as the poem ends, of extension beyond the self. So I'm quoting here, taking them out of themselves and to find themselves in a world that has neither rift nor rim. A monochrome world that has all the indulgence of color, a still world whose every harmonic is audible, largesse of spirit and stone. Created things for once and for all featured in full, while for once and never the creator who is destroyer stands at the last point of land featureless. In a dark cell, a phallus of granite, as abstract as the North Pole, as alone. But the visitor must move on, and the waves assault the temple, living in granite against dead water, and time with its weathering action make phrase and feature blurred. Still, from today we know what an avatar is. We have seen God take shape and dwell among shapes. We have felt our aging limbs respond to those ageless limbs in the rock reliefs. Relief is the word. So the poem is not in any overt way about partition, but that rift and rim, those fronts and borders, occur alongside that relief in a largesse of spirit that the poem kind of builds towards. The later Didymus is still more removed from such concerns. It's a poem of negative theology, and in some respects a kind of inversion of ecstasy. Nevertheless, it ends with the tribute that Thomas's honest doubt, which has driven him to touch the very wounds of God in doubting Jesus's reincarnation, constitutes a proof that, and to quote from that poem, all men are spirit. So again, rather than through kind of a moment of ecstasy, through this kind of negative doubt, we still get that sense of the importance of a kind of extension beyond the self, that men are spirit, that we're not just kind of trapped within the retina, to go back to the image of the other poem, and its response to the violence, intercommunal violence. Okay, so I now want to move back from this nexus of language, a language of division, this possibility of kind of communication between humans across cultures, and the language of spirituality that I'm kind of been trying to suggest is in play in McNeece's literary responses to India in 1947, to Yeats and Tagore in the 1910s. So Yeats first meets Tagore, and this is a story that's been told a lot, so I'm aware some of you might be very familiar with this. Yeats first met Tagore in late June 1912. by late July, they were meeting to talk through Tagore's prose translations into English of his own verse. The extent of Yeats's kind of editorial intervention or assistance is unclear and debated and disputed by critics. By late August, Yeats had written his introduction to the English version of these poems. A year later, in May 1913, at Yeats's instigation, a translation of Tagore's play The Post Office was premiered in Dublin at the Abbey Theatre. In 1914, the play was then published in Dublin by Yeats's sisters, Cooler Press, again at W.B. Yeats's instigation, with a short introductory note by him. It's also had some kind of involvement, again, somewhat kind of unclear and disputed, in 3 further volumes of Tagore's self-translated poems into English. The Crescent Moon in 1913, The Gardener in 1915, which was dedicated to Yeats, and Fruit Gathering in 1916. So we're getting this kind of intense period of engagement and contact and collaboration. And it's, as I said, it's generated a lot of critical discussion and commentary. Among these 2 comparative book-length studies published within the last 10 years by Suchendu Majumdar and Rajini Mohiti have illuminated the extent of Tagore's interests in Ireland prior to his meeting with Yeats in London in 1912. Majumdar points to Tagore's 1909 Bengali essay on reform in education, which draws parallels between the colonial education systems in Ireland and India, and shows Tagore's deep engagement, broad engagement with Irish culture and history. Majumdar also points to the close association between Tagore and the Irish-born sister Nivedita in this period that might have had an influence on his work. In the 1910 Bengali novel Gora, which was not then translated into English until the 1920s, Tagore uses, as Mohiti writes, the central character's mixed race, Irish heritage, as a narrative means to challenge his nationalism, simultaneously recognizing the liminal role of Irish soldiers in the British military in India, but also using Gora's race to critique Hindu nationalism by driving his protagonist to reject nationalism and embrace a more syncretic idea of the nation. Mohiti also sees this novel, which is set in the 1880s, as very much reflecting upon more recent history, the partition of Bengal since 1905. She writes, engaging with this nativism with knowledge of Irish sympathy of Indian nationalists, Tagore's novel goes on to question the underlying element of both nationalism and imperialism, namely purity. So there's this kind of emerging commonality between certain varieties of imperialism and nationalism that Ireland is kind of being used to critique by Tagore in this novel, according to Mohiti's reading. Such enlightening work, though, has not, I think, quite made sense of some of Yeats's subsequent responses to and presentation of Tagore, especially in relation to Ireland. On the 23rd of March 1913, Yeats gave a lecture on Tagore in Dublin, in part to trailer the play that would follow a couple of months later. Yeats is reported as then himself making many parallels between Ireland and India, including how in India, as in Ireland, English was made the vehicle of teaching in the schools with strange results upon the boys. So, I mean, a point I think he might well have been told about by Tagore. But Yeats also uses the speech to stress the importance of a separation between culture and politics. The lecture, so this is in the newspaper report of the lecture. The lecturer proceeded to inquire into the leading motives of Tagore's poetry and to the manner in which he turned aside from Indian politics. It was something of the same motive that led them in the Irish movement, and by that I think he means the theatre movement, the Abbey, to turn away from politics. I saw, continued Mr. Yeats, that when you are attempting to speak high things and sincere things, and at the same time carry on a political life, that sooner or later You give up the sincere things and high things, and you speak expedient things. Similarly, in his short introduction to the Cooler Press printing of the Post Office the next year, Yeats goes out of his way to resist attempts to discover detailed social history, the social or political allegory in that play. Instead, he argues for a less intellectual and more emotional and simple meaning, conveying to the right audience an emotion of gentleness and peace. I'm quoting that, conveying to the right audience an emotion of gentleness and peace. Yeats also kept thinking that Tagore's life story might be of use to himself, Yeats, in Ireland. In 1916, for instance, Yeats wrote to William Rothenstein, the English artist who'd introduced Tagore to Yeats. Yeats had been urging him, Tagore, to bring out a translation of his autobiography. And he explains to Rothenstein that perhaps I'm biased because I believe it to point a moral that would be valuable to me in Ireland. When the memoirs were translated and published in 1917, Yeats, however, they only covered Tagore's life up to the age of 25. Yeats then followed up in April 19 with urging Tagore to write a second half of those reminiscences, in which he would talk about the different movements of modern Bengal. So in which he would try and kind of map his cultural activity onto the kind of political fluctuations of modern Bengal, is how I'm reading that. Tagore, of course, had a complex, ambivalent relationship to politics, which others are far better equipped than I to consider. But something of Tagore's possible moral for Ireland might be grasped in turning to Tagore's lectures on nationalism that were published in 1917. In the opening lecture on nationalism in the West, Tagore writes of how the India has been given her problem from the beginning of history. It is the race problem. Races ethnologically different have in this country come into close contact. This fact has been and still continues to be the most important one in our history. It is our mission to face it and prove our humanity by dealing with it in the fullest sense of truth. Until we fulfill our mission, all other benefits will be denied us. And he goes on, neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history. And India has been trying to accomplish her task through social recognition of differences on the one hand, and the spiritual recognition of unity on the other. The recognition of spiritual unity and the social regulation of differences was thin on the ground in Ireland in the 1910s. Tagore's sentiments here, which I'm suggesting might have been discussed with Yeats, at an earlier point, when they had this kind of extreme intimacy, are perhaps redolent of a Yeats who, in 1912, after the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill into a bill into the British Parliament for the Home Rule of Ireland, but also the kind of ramping up of tensions in Northern Ireland, the kind of Ulster problem, the Ulster crisis, or the Home Rule crisis, as it was called. So in 1912, in April 1912, you have the introduction of this Home Rule Bill into the British Parliament. But alongside that, you also have in Northern Ireland the marching of 100,000 strong militia, the Ulster Volunteers, and in which Edward Carson, the leader of the Irish Union Alliance, is joined by Andrew Bonar Law, the leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the opposition, the man who would become, for a short period, Prime Minister eventually. He reviews these 100,000 militiamen. So I think a kind of extraordinary thing happened, extraordinary kind of, reviewing of paramilitary force by, the leader of the opposition on British soil, extraordinary event. And Yeats, in response, put his name to a joint public letter published in several newspapers by Protestant Dublin residents who desired to mark otherwise than by mere words our disapproval of the statement that Protestants in the southern parts of Ireland live in fear of their Catholic neighbours. The letter went on, it seems to us absurd to suppose that a difference in religious belief involves conflicting interests between ourselves and our fellow countrymen. Or in 1913, Yeats sorry, I forgot to change the slide, so that text is up there. And then there's text of this subsequent letter. So Yeats in 1913 writes to the Irish
I think Tom is disconnected, so I will have to ask him.
Connected. Please ask him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I have a technical issue. My laptop, which I was using to speak to you, has just stopped working. So
It's
my
fine, Tom.
so I'm speaking to you actually on my phone, which is not ideal. But I hope you can hear me okay. I'm gonna just try and do something so I can keep sharing the slides. So just bear with me. Sorry. I was overrunning a bit anyway. Okay. Hold on. We'll hopefully get back on track. Give me a second. So I have a desktop which doesn't have a camera on, so I'm just going to try to join with that. And then I can give you the slides, and we'll go back. Sorry about this. Okay. So I hope I'll be able to share the. Could the host make the other the other Walker TO able to share the screen? Is that possible? Sorry, Pavan. And then I can keep going. So the Walker TO is the one, not the one with the picture, the one that joined WALKERTO. If that could be the co-host. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm hoping this will now work. Okay, so please bear with me. It won't be too much longer. Okay. So, so in this 1913 letter to the editor of the Irish Worker, Yeats is expressing kind of dismay at events in Dublin, but he's kind of calling out sectarianism. I charged the Dublin Nationalist newspapers with deliberately arousing religious passion to break up the organization of the working man, with appealing to mob law day after day, with publishing the names of workmen and their wives for purposes of intimidation. And I charged the unionist press of Dublin and those who directed the police with conniving at this conspiracy. I want to know why the Daily Express, which is directly and indirectly inciting Ulster to rebellion in defense of what it calls the liberty of the subject, is also so indifferent to that liberty here in Dublin that it has not made one editorial comment. And I asked the Irish Times why a few sentences at the end of the article, too late in the week to be of any service, has been the measure of its love for civil liberty. So Yeats, is kind of seems to be somewhat aligned to Tagore in wanting this more kind of pluralistic, speaking out against sectarianism in the context of his nationalism. But I think one of the things that kind of reading Yeats back through McNeice and that later partition, and then in relation to Tagore, I think brings out is just how kind of self-conflicted Yeats's response is. That Yeats is actually, as well as pulling out such friction, is at this very same moment deeply implicated within it. In a letter to Lady Gregory, he talks about his Tagore speech as allowing him to free himself from the need for religious diplomacy. So in separating politics and culture, he's actually seeing this as giving him a license. And a lot of his work of that year is decidedly sectarian in nature. For instance, a poem he earlier published in the Unionist Irish Times, The Gift, as it's then called, it uses these terms, podine and biddy, until enough of podine's pence and biddy's halfpennies and length, which are very coarse, distinctly Hiberno English diminutives of Patrick, the country's patron saint, and Bridget, its most prominent female saint. So we're getting this kind of odd thing going on. He's in one letter, he's saying one thing, but his poems also in public have been very kind of offensive. And I think the newspaper context in which this poem is published is also important. You know, it's being published in a unionist newspaper, and it's surrounded, as I'm trying to show you here, by discussion of protests against home rule, a by-election in which he's talking about the unionist candidate, Colonel Platinum, a German talking about the Ulster crisis, with a very kind of strong sympathies with the unionist cause. And Yeats keeps repeating such offence in other poems published in this year. He talks about, prayer to shivering prayer in September 1913, another poem first published in the Irish Times. Again, he titles a poem called Podine, Our Old Podine in the Shop, and he publishes as a pamphlet poems written in discouragement. So he's talking about this separation between poetry and politics. He's talking in these kind of Tagore-esque terms about, kind of a degree of religious toleration in an Ireland that is kind of like a tinderbox of sectarianism and political division. And yet he's offering this sectarian and classist tinged offense in his work. And Yeats scholars are aware of this, but they've never kind of made that link to partition. They've seen it in terms of Dublin politics, in terms of Catholicism. But there's this kind of real knot there, which I think is very hard to make sense of. That I think this kind of comparative reading backwards I've been trying to do starts to highlight. I mean, I don't have the time today to go on to what that might quite mean for Yeats, but I suppose I'm wanting to highlight the fact that I think it is exposed or becomes into view through actually thinking about kind of India and thinking about this kind of triangulation between India and McNeice. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of try to draw to a conclusion. So over 20 years ago, Alika Burma, in her 2002 book, Empire, the National and the Post-Colonial, considered in some detail Tagore and Yeats's contact and collaboration. And in that book, she attempts to model a swivel away from a focus on the relationship between the European self and other, between the colonizer and the colonized, and instead focus on the contact zone of intercultural and political exchange, and how this might be positioned between peripheries under colonization, how colonial resistance might emerge amongst others, as she describes. But in trying to triangulate India, Yeats, and McNeice, I think the challenge arises of what it is to map a transnational contact zone, let alone any notions of resistance, in which the writers themselves and their positions are so marked by a hybridity of identity and an implication within the structures and hierarchies and crises of colonization. In his recent fine book, comparing the work of Tagore and Yeats, Ashing Dutta writes of trying to shift critical emphasis from cultural, political, or post-colonial readings of their content towards placing a stress on their shared involvement in transcultural mysticism as a kind of response to modernity. But I think this opposition itself risks eliding how the mystical might be a response to the cultural and the social and political and vice versa. I suppose my contention is that while we must recognize how far Yeats and McNeice were from knowing or understanding India and its culture, the alteriety and hybridity of their somewhat colonial yet also colonized gaze can be grasped through attending to their contact with India and its culture. India has much to teach them and to teach us about them, if not itself offering any kind of satisfactory entry point into India and its culture. Moreover, I would also suggest that this alteriety and hybridity produced under and through colonization is a significant part of what at various points pushes these writers' works beyond the sentimentality of romanticism on the one hand, or the certainties of social realism on the other, towards the kind of intellectual and aesthetic territory, the alternative vision that seems to constitute what we talk of when we talk about modernism. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you for bearing with me amid all the technological chaos. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. We are especially thankful for three observations that you made. In India also, we have this feeling that modernism was a kind of earthquake, where which saw the collapse of all kinds of structures, not only the political structures, but also the structures within poetry, in all art forms. And when you talk about the crashing of hierarchies, talk about the image of birds crossing borders. It was actually a kind of border crossing even in Yoners. And I was wondering if in autumn journals, the kind of Proustian delirium looms large when he captures the landscape pregnant with political and personal disasters. Like he also captures the boot of Hitler, all kinds of sounds. Do you think, when he writes about India and the political disruptions here and the partitions here, in his letters, I've just seen, I've listened to a radio talk, BBC talk, where they were partially reading out what he'd read, but I've not read the whole document. But you've, of course, referred to some very, very interesting images, like the charring of the, how the disruption in the retina, causes the lack of vision, that kind of a thing. And, I would want you to say if that kind of intensity pervades. And, though we, in modernism, we think about, all the writers, main writers talking about the lack of rising above music, and we talk about the mere music of meaning, how he, in a very musical way, captures the haunting images and all the sounds of war and partition and all kinds of things. If you have something to, that you could share with us, we'll definitely be very, very privileged. And then you talk about border crossing, definitely. I was also wondering, Tom, if the kind of joint family or collaboration of spirits in Spiritus Mundi, can be extended to the concept of a joint family or the extended family of ex-colonies. Did these writers ever think of political parallels? We definitely had, and we had the kind of cultural memories also where we had many parallels. It was the impoverished ex-colony thinking about liberation like Marquez thinks about liberation, in terms of, magic realist thing. Were they actually thinking of collaborating together, and the kind of spiritual collaborations that Yeats had even with her ex-lovers and friends, and even Rabindranath Tagore that you referred to. Was that a kind of a search for alternative power, a kind of power to draw sustenance for building a new kind of society? So these are the two questions that that came to my mind by listening to your very insightful paper, and the kind of cosmopolitan vision of nationalism, and how he says, I've noted down what you said, if we do not give them nationhood, what do we give? So that kind of offering nationhood, that kind of a cosmopolitanism, and the kind of border crossing and joining hands. So if you could just by way of I'm talking through my hand, but I'm very, very thank you for the presentation, and the whole idea of it being a subjective observation and not an objective observation. If one kind of documentation would be to just collect facts and then weave it into a radio drama. But as you said, he's made a very subjective kind of observations. So these are the few questions that came to my mind, and thank you for the slides, and thank you for the whole perspective. So if we start discussion, can we come up? And also, in one of the readings of the second coming I had read, somebody was linking Hitler with Christ in the second coming. And people also talk about his being very close, being very close to Mussolini. Can a mystic be a fascist? Because the person who doesn't care for things but only the essences of things, these people, both Macnies and Yeats, they were the kind of people who would care for the essences of things. So such people, the kind of vision that they have even in their raptured retina, is something that this kind of a reading actually subverts. So what do you say to all this?
Okay, thank you. Lots of really interesting thoughts there. I mean, I suppose to begin with McNeice, I mean, it's interesting you were talking about Autumn Journal.
Mm-hmm.
And, Autumn Journal is a very kind of, as you say, kind of transnational poem. It's a poem we're getting a lot of impressions, but he's moving. He goes to Spain, he goes to France, he's in Britain. He's kind of it's a poem with lots of trains, lots of movement, and lots of impressions. I think in some ways it's I would see the pre-war McNeice as still being quite empirical, and his empiricism is very kind of knowing and thoroughgoing, so that he's not a kind of confident empiricist. He's not someone who is kind of saying, I know through the senses. It's qualified, and the very form, Autumn Journal, that journal form is a way of formally enacting that qualification. So he's kind of saying, these are my impressions, but the next journal entry might actually contradict them. And again, formally, that's quite closely aligned to the letter. So in the late 30s, him and Auden particularly, they start writing these verse letters. So again, it's their public letters, but they're from one person at one point of time addressed to another person. So they're quite kind of qualified. And I think that's how he starts out with almost a kind of extreme form of that with India. He cannot capture things through the impressions. So, it's interesting that he writes a verse letter to an individual, to his wife. Is the first kind of poem he writes. And that the radio documentaries are very kind of qualified and circumscribed in their voice. I think what's interesting is that he almost breaks through that to this kind of idea of some kind of possibility of of connection. I mean, again, very circumspectly, very qualifiedly, but so he kind of got, I think he does want that, and I think he needs that in response to the kind of horrors he's been witnessing. I mean, there's a parallel move. There's quite a similar-ish move in relation a bit to the Second World War, when he's experiencing the Blitz, when he comes back to London and is living through the Blitz of the war. That kind of need for, or desire, at least a desire for spiritual connection, to kind of break out of that, that kind of solipsistic model of mind that we get through a certain kind of empiricism. So I think that's kind of McNeece's move. The kind of vagueness or the kind of spirituality that you might associate with Romanticism and might seem as being implicated, say, in Yeats's suspect politics and other suspect politics. I think he actually starts to see that it's more complicated. With Yeats, I mean, it's kind of much more complicated. The point of Yeats, at the point I was kind of trying to shine a bit of a light on, is saying these very kind of, things that sound very palatable, I think, to in terms of kind of avoiding sectarianism. But I suppose I'm interested that he's doing that at the exact moment where he's actually becoming a much more political poet, and a much more troublingly political poet in the early 1910s. I mean, his flirtations with fascism are later, in the 20s and the 30s. He is interested in and attracted to Mussolini. There's a brief flirtation with an Irish fascist movement, the Blue Shirts. But he's an anti-democrat. He's an authoritarian in his politics. So I suppose what I find interesting is that the kind of the connection he wants in and around 1912, 1913 is almost immediately coming under great strain at home. So that kind of cosmopolitan connection with Tagore at home is more or less unsustainable at the level of his own personal coherence. So, and he then actually embraces an aesthetics of conflict, an aesthetics of tragedy, which can at times take him towards something that certainly looks quite a lot like fascism. But he also always keeps this dialectic with, as you say, a kind of, a more spiritual, mystical kind of sense of connection. So the 30s would be a case in point. He's the kind of, he's embracing this authoritarian politics, eugenic politics, but he's also, it's the period where he's very closely collaborating on the translation of the Upanishads. He's deep into Indian mysticism through that period, through Puruswami. So, he's so I think you kind of, with Yeats, you've got it's not so much a story of kind of a trajectory or a kind of development as multiple things happening at once, and sometimes very paradoxical things happening at once. But I suppose I'm interested in trying to recover that kind of absence of the connection between, what he's saying on the one hand and actually how he's behaving and also kind of articulating through his poetry on the other, that seems to arise with Tagore. So, lots of people have written about the way that he becomes disenchanted with Tagore. He perhaps starts to see Tagore as being too sentimental, some of these kinds of things. But actually, there's almost a kind of, a kind of absence and aporia in his thinking, that I think thinking about partition really kind of, and about Tagore in India kind of starts to highlight. So very long answer. Sorry.
No. I mean, this was a very insightful presentation. And now I open it to the gallery. If you have questions, you can please ask him. Pavan?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, Tom, for such an enlightening talk. So I really want to know about Louis MacNeice's idea on mysticism, his take on mysticism, because it's completely different from that of Yeats. Because the way he is trying to describe, the way he is trying to project that there was like colonial influence or Western influence on Indian mysticism. But for Yeats, it was more of like experiential in nature. So some critics believe that Yeats moved away from politics. But personally, I feel that his political interest got subsumed in his mystical endeavor and metaphorically reincarnated in the form of his magnum opus, A Vision. So Yeats, there are different stages in Yeats's life. So in his later career, he was like more of interested in mysticism, occult, and esoteric philosophy. So what do you think about uh, MacNeice's idea about mysticism? Because it's like he is just trying to interpret it as an outsider and not as someone who really wants to experience it and understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he is yeah, I mean, he's a kind of he's a skeptic, which obviously Yeats is not really. So he's coming from that kind of much more skeptical point of view. I mean, I think he would be he'd also be much more cautious about knowing things than Yeats. So I think it's also a kind of epistemological disposition that
Yeah,
Yeats over-identifies. So Yeats, when he sees something that kind of equates to something he thinks or wants to think, will run towards it and will kind of grab it and scoop it up into his thinking. Whereas MacNeice is he's a much more formally trained intellectual figure than Yeats. So MacNeice is, a starry classics and philosophy student at Oxford. He becomes a professional classicist. So, so he's often thinking of his approach to mysticism is actually often being directed through the classics. So he's thinking of Plato and Aristotle and other people sometimes in his thinking about these things and philosophical categories. So it's a very different disposition, for sure. And I think he would be very, I mean, he actually absorbs a lot when you read the letters, and he's actually reading very widely. He's absorbing a lot about India, about Indian art and Indian thought. But he kind of, unlike Yeats, he wouldn't kind of claim that authority so quickly over it. It doesn't really kind of manifest itself that overtly or in the work, or the work kind of is much more careful about how it's framing that knowledge and mediating that knowledge. But, and this is, I suppose, those things look very different. But I think I suppose one of the things I think is quite interesting is that I think at times it does take them to quite similar places, in terms of what their work ends up doing or offering. So it's almost like, we talk about the Yeatsian dialectic. I think Enda Longley talks about MacNeice being a dialectical reader of Yeats. And I think there's also that sense that he's a kind of dialectical kind of embracer of the mystical. In the beginning of his Yeats book, he talks about, despite his many disagreements with Yeats, about embracing that mystical. But his idea of mysticism is that we actually have, at some point, we cannot know the value of life. So our mysticism resides in a faith in life. So again, that kind of empirical disconnect, that problem of not being able to know things, that has to be bridged by faith and mysticism. But there's no kind of sense of a vision with a capital V, that kind of big historical schema, the phases of the moon, all that stuff we get in a vision. You're never going to get that kind of system building from MacNeice.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Anyone else who wants to ask a question? Because he's really worked hard in British Library and British Museum, and he's so full, his the primary and secondary sources are so rich. It's a good time to ask him questions. He would answer in great details. He's such a learned young scholar. Anybody else? So the last question, I was wondering if these people ever used these, even Yeats, for instance, ever thought of using spiritual power as a kind of alternative. In our country, for instance, Gandhi he wanted to tap his spiritual energies for political renegotiations. I was wondering if ever you're a Yeats scholar also. Yeats also thought of tapping spiritual energy for political renegotiations, and of course, one kind comes up with because when one reads his diaries and his observations in prose, one is also moved by the way he refers to sitting in a restaurant and viewing strangers, and then a sudden light taking him over, and then his urge to, and then he makes a very moving observations in one of the passages that I read a year back. He says, when I am full of hatred for other people, or I'm irritated with other kinds of political and social organizations, then I do not get the vision. But when I'm full of ecstasy and love, then suddenly the world looks like one. And this oneness of being across borders is something that all these visionaries must be thinking about. I think all the people in the interwar years were basically thinking of one world. And the whole idea of world literature and world religion, must have come up with, with this view, if a vision of building cultural parallels, a home, and, and pointing out the oneness of being across borders. So what is your perception? I was just, but because you've now started living in Dublin and you are an insider outsider, and you are teaching in a college where Protestants were not allowed at some point of time. I have read somewhere that Protestants were not allowed. I mean, they were not admitted, or maybe if they were not, you had to convert. So, what is your reading of the situation? What do you think? What are the changes? And what is your perception of? Yes, has always intrigued us. So, this is the question we would really want you to reflect on.
I mean, I think you put it very well, really, that with Yeats, he does imagine those kinds of ecstatic and moments, and perhaps quite utopian moments. But I mean, they're thin on the ground, like they are moments, and so they're often in dialect with other things. So, and his idealization, he's going to the past or to other cultures for kind of more integrated cultures. And there is obviously a kind of utopian aspect to that, but there is also something more forbidding. He in his thinking about the soul, he often thinks he thinks about the lonely soul, so the soul kind of journeying into the afterlife. So I mean, he gets that from various places, Plato and things, the Timaeus. But he so it's an anima mundi, it's a world soul, but he's also keeping this idea of the kind of the alienated soul. I mean, I suppose the poem I would think about that, which he actually writes in 1913, 1912, So when he's kind of at the height of his engagement with Tagore, is The Cold Heaven, this kind of poem of this kind of moment of kind of soul's ecstasy, but it's a very lonely, chilly ecstasy. So, you know, so I think, you know, like, I think you're right, these kind of, so many of these writers of the 20s and 30s and 1910s, you know, I suppose I think of the Ian Forster phrase, you know, from Howard's end, only connect, you know.
Yes, yes. First,
you know,
yes.
You know, that seems to be, you know, or you think of Virginia Woolf and the waves and these kind of interconnected minds. So, you know, you've got loads of kind of high modernist texts where something of that is happening.
And I know, Tom, the idea to preserve, I suppose, in a land full of deaths and losses, loneliness and a lonely venture is a very natural thing, isn't it? You want to try out everything and, you know, prevent it somewhere. So
Yeah.
preservation of cultures, traditions, maybe that was the instinct.
But I mean, I think you do have to take the measure of, you know, the scale of what is happening in the early and mid 20th century, and also the kind of scale of it happening globally, in terms of, and also because of the kind of changes in media, the way that this is so visible and kind of clearly kind of reported and circulated. You know, that when you read about things like Indian partition, but also, you know, First World War, the Second World War, obviously, but other, you know, all kinds of other things, you know, the scale of that is harrowing, you know. So I think you do have to kind of, these people are reckoning with a kind of proximity to a scale of global violence, you know, and that's got to affect people. You know, if you believe in an idea of a world soul, that's going to kind of affect it. You know, people, I mean, I always think of Elizabeth Bowen writes very well of living in London during the Second World War, and she talks about dreaming. Your dreams change, you know, when this is happening. So, you know, you could view that psychologically. You don't need.
Yeah, everybody is in a quest of utopia, of course. Why not?
But also the disturbance of the psyche or the soul, whatever you want to call it. But that is definitely kind of happening for all these writers. So that utopian thing is happening, but also this kind of this disturbance, this anxiety of lack of things.
You know, this very melancholic. All these poets, you know, even like Louis MacNeice, for instance, his delight in vividness, and then is all hedged over by a sharp sense of melancholy. It's very, very moving, especially in autumn.
Yeah.
So
it can, yeah.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for the very, very insightful, and both for your intensity and your range. I can just say, keep it up. We're looking forward to your books, and, you know, we keep an eye on whatever you do. You know, heartfelt blessings. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Are they there, or they've disappeared?
They might have gone. They seem to have disappeared. Anyway, it was very nice to meet you. I will try and see. I will try and. Has any of your poems been translated into English?
Yes, I'll send you some of the poems.
Okay, I would love to read them. That would be
London right now. If you ever come to London, just let me know.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Our email ID. We'll keep in touch. I really look forward to reading you. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.